The bullet had torn clean through Thomas Yates's side, and by the time his horse stumbled in the December snow of the Cascade Mountains, he knew he was dying. Blood painted a crimson trail down the white slope as he fell from the saddle, his vision swimming with pain and cold, the world tilting on an axis that made no sense anymore. Behind him, somewhere in the darkness of the mountain pass, the three men who had ambushed him near the mining camp were probably riding away with the gold shipment he had been transporting, leaving him to freeze and bleed out in the wilderness. The year was 1882, and Thomas had survived 2 years as a freight guard without incident until tonight, when everything had gone catastrophically wrong. He pressed his hand against the wound, feeling the hot pulse of blood against his frozen fingers. The snow was coming down harder now, thick flakes that obscured the path he had taken. His horse had bolted, disappearing into the white curtain of the storm. Thomas tried to stand, managed 3 steps, and collapsed against a boulder. The cold was almost worse than the pain, seeping through his coat and into his bones. He had maybe an hour before the blood loss took him, less if he could not get warm. The irony was not lost on him that he might freeze before he bled out completely. He thought about his sister in Seattle, waiting for him to return from this last job. He had promised her he would quit after this run, take the money he had saved and help her with the boarding house she was trying to keep afloat after their parents had died. 26 years old, and he was going to die on a mountain because he had trusted the wrong people with information about his route. One of the other guards had to have told the ambushers where he would be. Thomas pressed harder against the wound, gritting his teeth against the wave of agony that crashed through him. The sound of hoofbeats made him reach for his revolver, but his fingers were too numb to grip it properly. If the ambushers had come back to finish him, he was in no condition to fight. But the rider who emerged from the snow was smaller than he expected, bundled in a heavy coat with a scarf wrapped around the lower half of her face. A woman, alone on the mountain in the middle of a blizzard. Thomas tried to call out, but his voice came as barely a rasp. Victoria Granger had been riding back from the logging camp, where she delivered medical supplies, when the storm had caught her. At 23, she had been working as an unofficial nurse in the scattered settlements around Seattle for 2 years, ever since she had learned enough from the elderly doctor who had taken her under his wing. Dr. Morrison was too old now to make these mountain runs himself, so Victoria had volunteered, needing the money and the purpose after her father's logging accident had left her mother dependent on her income. She knew these trails better than most, but the storm had disoriented her, and she had been trying to find shelter when she saw the dark shape against the boulder. At first, she thought it was an animal. Then she saw the blood in the snow, the trail of it leading back up the mountain, and she urged her horse forward. The man was slumped against the rock, his face pale and his hand pressed to his side. Victoria dismounted quickly, her medical training overriding her fear of being alone in the wilderness with a stranger. She had seen enough injuries in the logging camps to recognize a gunshot wound when she saw one. "Can you hear me?" she asked, kneeling beside him and pulling the scarf down from her face. Her breath misted in the freezing air. Thomas focused on her with effort, dark hair escaping from beneath her hat, gray eyes that were sharp with intelligence and concern. Pretty, even in the harsh conditions, though that seemed like an absurd thing to notice when he was dying. "Shot," he managed to say. "Ambushed." "I can see that," Victoria said, her hands already moving to assess the damage. She pulled his hand away from the wound and saw the blood welling up. "We need to stop this bleeding. Can you ride?" "No horse," Thomas said. "Bolted." Victoria looked around quickly. The snow was falling so heavily now that she could barely see 20 feet in any direction. They could not stay here, exposed to the elements, but she could not get him onto her horse in his condition, and she could not leave him to search for shelter. She made a decision in the span of a heartbeat, the kind of decision that came from 2 years of emergency medicine in rough conditions. "I am going to need you to stay conscious," she told him firmly. "I am going to stop the bleeding here, and then we are going to find shelter. There is an old trapper's cabin about half a mile east of here if I have my bearings right. Can you hold on that long?" Thomas wanted to tell her that he probably could not, that she should save herself and leave him, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. Instead, he nodded, and that small movement cost him more energy than he could afford. Victoria worked quickly. She tore strips from her own petticoat, blessing the fact that she always wore practical layers under her riding clothes. She wadded one of the strips against the entry wound and another against the exit wound in his back, noting with some relief that the bullet had gone clean through. That was better than having to dig it out, at least. She pressed hard, ignoring Thomas's sharp intake of breath. "I know it hurts," she said, "but I need to get the bleeding under control before we move you." "Who are you?" Thomas asked through gritted teeth. The pressure was agony, but it was also keeping him conscious, giving him something to focus on besides the cold. "Victoria Granger," she said. "I work with Dr. Morrison in Seattle. Medical supplies run to the camps. You?" "Thomas Yates, freight guard," he coughed, tasting copper. "Was supposed to be watching a gold shipment." "Did they get it?" Victoria asked, keeping the pressure steady on the wound. "Yes," Thomas said bitterly. "They got it and left me to die." "Well, you are not going to die," Victoria said with a confidence she did not entirely feel. "Not if I have anything to say about it. The bleeding is slowing. I am going to bind this as tight as I can, and then we are getting you onto my horse. Do you understand?" Thomas understood that she was small and he was 6 feet of deadweight, and the logistics seemed impossible. But she was already working, binding the makeshift bandages around his torso with strips of cloth, pulling them tight enough that he gasped. Her hands were cold but steady, and there was something calming about her presence, the way she spoke to him as if his survival was a foregone conclusion. Getting him onto the horse was a nightmare. Victoria had to half drag, half carry him the few feet to where her mare stood patiently in the snow. Thomas tried to help, but his legs kept giving out, and by the time Victoria finally got him draped over the saddle, both of them were breathing hard, and Thomas was dangerously close to passing out. "Stay with me," Victoria commanded, mounting behind him and wrapping one arm around his waist to keep him in place. She kept her other hand free to guide the horse. "Talk to me, Thomas. Tell me about Seattle. Do you have family there?" "Sister," Thomas mumbled against the horse's neck. "Sarah. She runs a boarding house on 2nd Avenue. "I know 2nd Avenue," Victoria said, guiding the horse carefully through the snow. The visibility was terrible, but she was trusting her instincts and the mare's sense of direction. "I used to walk past there when I was working at the hospital downtown." "What is the name of the house?" "Yates' house," Thomas said. He could feel the warm trickle of blood despite the bandages, could feel his strength draining away with it. "Creative, I know," Victoria laughed, a short, sharp sound that was almost lost in the wind. "At least it is straightforward. My father always said that was a virtue." She kept talking, keeping him engaged, asking him questions about his sister, about his work, about anything that would keep him conscious. She could feel him slipping, his weight becoming heavier against her arm, and she urged the horse faster, hoping desperately that she had the right direction. The cabin appeared out of the snow like a miracle, a dark shape that resolved into weathered logs and a sagging roof. Victoria nearly cried with relief. She dismounted as carefully as she could, then dragged Thomas down from the saddle. He was unconscious now, his face gray in the dim light. Victoria got her arms under his shoulders and hauled him toward the cabin door, her boots slipping in the snow. The door was unlocked, as these remote shelters usually were, maintained by an unspoken code of the wilderness for anyone caught in bad weather. Victoria pulled Thomas inside and let him down as gently as she could onto the rough wooden floor. Then she went back out into the storm to get her horse into the lean-to shelter attached to the cabin and to grab her saddlebags with her medical supplies. Inside, she worked by feel in the darkness until she found an old oil lamp and matches on a shelf. The lamp sputtered to life, casting dancing shadows across the single-room cabin. There was a potbelly stove in the corner, a few pieces of rough furniture, and a pile of dry wood that made Victoria want to weep with gratitude. Whoever had last used this place had followed the code and left it stocked for the next traveler in need. But first, before she could worry about heat, she had to worry about Thomas's wound. He was unconscious, which in some ways made her work easier. Victoria unbuttoned his coat and shirt, examining the bandages she had applied on the mountainside. They were soaked through with blood, but the flow had slowed to a seep. She stripped away the wet cloth and examined the wound in the lamplight. The bullet hole was high on his left side, below the ribs. It had missed the vital organs, but it had torn through muscle and probably cracked a rib on the way out. Victoria cleaned the wound as best she could with water from her canteen and whiskey from her medical supplies, then packed it with clean bandages. Thomas stirred and groaned when she pulled the bandages tight, but he did not wake. With the wound dressed as well as she could manage, Victoria turned her attention to keeping them both alive through the night. She got the fire going in the stove, feeding it carefully until the flames were crackling and heat began to spread through the small space. Then she stripped off Thomas's wet coat and boots, covering him with the blankets from the cabin's narrow bunk and every spare piece of clothing she could find. His skin was cold to the touch, too cold, and she knew that hypothermia was as much a threat now as the blood loss. Victoria made herself coffee from the supplies in her saddlebags, more for the warmth than anything else, and settled down on the floor next to Thomas. She checked his pulse, finding it thready but steady. The wound was still seeping, and she pressed a fresh bandage against it, applying pressure. This was going to be a long night. The hours stretched out in the flickering lamplight. The storm howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows and sending drafts of cold air through the gaps in the logs. Victoria kept the fire going, kept pressure on Thomas's wound, and tried not to think about how precarious their situation was. They were miles from any real settlement, in a blizzard, with a man who had lost dangerous amounts of blood. Even if the storm cleared by morning, getting him back to Seattle was going to be a challenge. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness through the night. Sometimes he would murmur things that made no sense, fevered ramblings about gold and betrayal, and someone named Jack who had sold him out. Other times he would wake enough to register the pain, his eyes flying open in panic, until Victoria spoke to him in low, soothing tones, reminding him where he was and that he was safe. "You need to hold still," she told him during one of these moments when he tried to sit up and nearly reopen the wound. "You have been shot, Thomas. You need to let your body heal." "How long?" he asked, his voice rough. "It is a few hours past midnight, I think," Victoria said. She had lost track of time, measuring it only in the intervals when she added wood to the fire and changed the bandages on Thomas's wound. "The storm is still going strong. You should not have risked yourself," Thomas said. He could remember now, vaguely, the feeling of being dragged through the snow, the struggle to get onto the horse. "Could have left me." "I could have," Victoria agreed, But then what kind of nurse would I be? Besides, I have spent too much energy on you now to let you die out of principle." Despite everything, Thomas found himself almost smiling. "Practical." "Extremely," Victoria said. She adjusted the pressure on the wound, checking to see if the bleeding had finally stopped. It seemed to have, though the bandages were still damp. "Now stop talking and save your strength. You are going to need it." Thomas drifted off again, and Victoria continued her vigil. Her hand ached from the constant pressure, her back hurt from sitting on the hard floor, and exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. But she could not stop. If she let up the pressure, if she fell asleep and the wound reopened, Thomas could bleed out before morning. So she stayed awake, feeding the fire with her free hand, drinking bitter coffee and watching the slow rise and fall of Thomas's chest. Dawn came gradually, the darkness outside the windows fading to a lighter gray. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a world muffled in fresh snow. Victoria stood stiffly, her joints protesting, and went to the window. The landscape was unrecognizable, drifts piled high against the cabin and trees bent under the weight of ice. They were not going anywhere today, not until the trails were passable again. Thomas woke properly as the sun rose higher, his eyes clearer than they had been all night. He found Victoria sitting beside him, her hand still pressed to the bandage on his side, her face pale with exhaustion. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair had come completely loose from its pins, hanging in waves around her shoulders. "You stayed all night," he said, and it was not a question. "Someone had to keep pressure on the wound," Victoria said. "Could not very well do that while sleeping." "You should rest now," Thomas said. He felt weak as a kitten, but the sharp edge of pain had dulled to a persistent ache. "I will be all right for a while." "The bleeding has stopped," Victoria said, finally lifting her hand away and examining the bandage critically. "That is a good sign. But you are not out of danger yet. The wound could become infected, or you could start bleeding again if you move too much. We need to stay here until you are stronger and the weather clears enough for travel." Thomas looked around the cabin, taking it in properly for the first time. It was rough but serviceable and blessedly warm. "How long do you think?" "A few days at least," Victoria said. She stood, swaying slightly. "Maybe a week. Depends on how you heal." "Your family will be worried," Thomas said, "if you do not come back." "My mother knows I sometimes get delayed in the mountains," Victoria said, though she could not quite hide the flicker of concern in her eyes. "She will not expect me until the weather clears anyway. What about your sister?" "I was not due back for another 3 days," Thomas said. "The job was supposed to take longer." He closed his eyes, frustration welling up. "She's going to hear about the robbery before I can tell her I am alive. The mining company will report it. We will get word to her as soon as we can," Victoria promised. She was rummaging through her supplies, taking stock of what they had. "We have enough food for a few days if we are careful. There is a stream behind the cabin, probably frozen, but I can melt snow for water. We will manage." Over the next days, they fell into a routine born of necessity. Victoria tended Thomas's wound twice a day, cleaning it and changing the bandages, monitoring for any signs of infection. Thomas slept most of the time, his body fighting to recover from the trauma and blood loss. When he was awake, they talked, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. Victoria told him about her work, about the satisfaction of helping people, and the frustration of the limitations of frontier medicine. She told him about her father's death in the logging accident, about how she had watched helplessly as he bled out because she did not have the knowledge or supplies to save him. That was what had driven her to apprentice with Dr. Morrison, to learn everything she could so she would never feel that helpless again. Thomas told her about growing up in Seattle, about watching the city transform from a muddy settlement to a bustling port town. He told her about his parents, who had run a dry goods store until the financial panic of 1873 had wiped them out. He had taken work as a freight guard to support Sarah and himself, learning to handle a gun and spending long weeks on the trail. It was not the life he had imagined for himself, but it was honest work and it paid well. "What did you imagine?" Victoria asked. They were sitting near the fire, Thomas propped up against the bunk with blankets around him. He was stronger now, able to sit up without feeling faint, though the wound still pained him considerably. "I wanted to be a carpenter," Thomas admitted. "Work with my hands, build things that would last. I was apprenticed to a master carpenter when I was 16, learning the trade. But then my father got sick and the medical bills ate through everything. I had to take work that paid more faster." "You still want that?" Victoria asked. "To build things?" "Sometimes," Thomas said. "When I am on the trail, I think about it. What I would build if I had the chance. A house with good bones and fine joinery, the kind of place that would stand for generations." He looked at her, at the way the firelight brought out the red highlights in her dark hair. "What about you? What did you imagine?" "I never imagined anything but this," Victoria said honestly. "Even as a girl, I wanted to heal people. My mother used to say I was always bringing home injured animals, trying to nurse them back to health. Half of them died despite my efforts, but some of them lived, and that was enough to keep me trying." "You saved my life," Thomas said quietly. "I should have said that before. Thank you." Victoria met his eyes and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. "You are welcome." By the fourth day, Thomas was able to stand and walk a few steps, though Victoria hovered anxiously and made him sit back down after every attempt. The wound was healing cleanly, no signs of infection, and his color was returning. Victoria had been rationing their food carefully, making thin stews from the dried meat and beans in her supplies, supplemented by the emergency stores in the cabin. It was not much, but it was keeping them alive. The weather had cleared, the sun shining brilliantly on the snow-covered mountains, but the trails were still treacherous. Victoria scouted each day, checking to see if the path back to Seattle was passable. On the fifth day, she came back with cautious optimism. "I think we can try tomorrow," she said. "If you are strong enough. The main trail has been partly cleared by the wind, and my horse can handle the rest if we go slowly." Thomas nodded. He was eager to get back, to let Sarah know he was alive, but he was also strangely reluctant to leave the cabin. These days with Victoria had been strange and intense, a kind of intimacy born from shared survival. He had come to look forward to their conversations, to the sound of her voice, and the way she laughed at his dry observations. She was smart and brave and capable, and he found himself thinking about her in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude for saving his life. But he was a freight guard with no prospects, and she was a skilled nurse with a calling. Once they returned to Seattle, they would go back to their separate lives, and this would become just a story they told, about the time they survived a blizzard in the mountains. That night, their last in the cabin, they sat up late by the fire. Thomas was mending his shirt, which Victoria had washed and dried, threading a needle with careful precision despite the weakness in his hands. Victoria was repacking her medical supplies, making sure everything was secure for the journey. "What will you do?" Victoria asked. "About the robbery, I mean. Will you try to find the men who did it?" "I will tell the mining company what happened," Thomas said. "Beyond that, it is up to them. They will probably hire the Pinkertons to track down the gold. As for me, I am done with guard work." I nearly died because someone sold me out and I am not interested in a repeat performance. What will you do instead?" "I do not know yet," Thomas admitted. "I have some money saved, maybe enough to start over with something else. Sarah has been asking me to help her expand the boarding house, add more rooms. Maybe I will do that, use my carpentry skills for something constructive." "She would probably appreciate that," Victoria said. She hesitated, then added, "I hope you will not disappear entirely. It would be nice to know you are all right after all this." Thomas looked at her, at the vulnerability in her expression, and felt something shift in his chest. "I would like that too, very much." The ride back to Seattle took most of the day. Thomas rode behind Victoria, holding onto her waist, his side a constant ache despite the careful bandaging. They stopped frequently to rest, and Victoria watched him with the sharp eyes of a nurse, ready to call a halt if he showed signs of deteriorating. But Thomas held on, driven by sheer stubbornness and the knowledge that they were close to safety. Seattle appeared in the distance as the sun was setting, the town sprawling along the waterfront, smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys. Thomas felt a surge of relief so strong it was almost painful. They had made it. They were alive. Victoria brought them to Dr. Morrison's house first, a neat structure on the edge of town. The elderly doctor came out at the sound of hoofbeats, his face creasing with relief when he saw Victoria. "Girl, I have been worried sick," he said, helping Thomas down from the horse. "Your mother came by 3 times asking after you." "I got caught in the storm," Victoria explained, "and I found Thomas shot and bleeding on the mountain trail. We had to shelter in the old trapper's cabin until it was safe to travel." Dr. Morrison examined Thomas with practiced efficiency, asking terse questions about the wound and the treatment. When he was satisfied, he nodded approvingly at Victoria. "You did good work, girl. He is alive because of you. Now get inside, both of you. He needs a proper bed and monitoring, and you look about ready to fall over." Thomas wanted to protest that he needed to get to Sarah, but Victoria was already shaking her head. "Your sister will be here soon enough. The doctor is right. You need to rest properly. I will send someone to fetch her." Over the next week, Thomas recovered in Dr. Morrison's house, sleeping in a spare room that the doctor used for patients who needed overnight care. Sarah came immediately when she received the message, throwing her arms around Thomas and crying with relief. She had indeed heard about the robbery and had been fearing the worst when he did not return on schedule. "You scared me half to death," she said, wiping her eyes. She was 3 years older than Thomas, a practical woman with the same dark hair and determined chin. "When they said there had been shooting and a guard was missing, I thought." "I know," Thomas said, holding her hand. "I am sorry, but I am all right now thanks to Victoria." Sarah turned to Victoria, who was checking Thomas's bandages with professional detachment. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "My brother is all the family I have left." "He is healing well," Victoria said. "The wound was clean and there is no infection. He should make a full recovery, though he needs to take it easy for a few more weeks." "He will," Sarah said firmly, giving Thomas a look that brooked no argument. "Even if I have to sit on him to make him stay in bed." As the days passed and Thomas grew stronger, he found himself looking forward to Victoria's visits. She came twice a day to check on him, and they fell back into the easy conversation they had developed in the cabin. She told him about her other patients, about the challenges of practicing medicine in a rough town where accidents were common and doctors were scarce. He told her about Sarah's plans for the boarding house, about how he was thinking seriously about helping her expand it now that his guard work was behind him. "You should do it," Victoria said. She was sitting in the chair beside his bed, her medical bag at her feet. "You would be good at it." and it would be safer than getting shot at by robbers. Considerably safer, Thomas agreed. He hesitated, then said, "Would you come visit? After I am recovered and settled, I mean. Sarah would want to thank you properly, maybe have you for dinner." Victoria smiled. "I would like that." When Thomas was finally discharged, he moved back to the boarding house, taking over one of the ground floor rooms so he would not have to manage stairs. Sarah fussed over him, bringing him meals and scolding him when he tried to do too much too soon. But Thomas was healing well, the wound closing cleanly, and he was eager to start working again, even in a limited capacity. He began drawing up plans for the expansion Sarah wanted, sketching out new rooms and calculating costs. It felt good to be using his carpentry knowledge again, to be creating something instead of just guarding other people's property. Sarah was delighted with his ideas, and they spent hours discussing the details, planning for a future that seemed brighter than it had in years. True to her word, Victoria came to dinner a week after Thomas moved back to the boarding house. Sarah had prepared a feast, determined to show her gratitude, and the three of them sat in the boarding house's dining room, eating and talking as the evening light faded outside the windows. "This is delicious," Victoria said, and she meant it. Her own cooking skills were rudimentary at best, focused more on nutrition than flavor. "You are a wonderful cook, Sarah." "Thank you," Sarah said. "It is one of the few talents I have that is actually useful in running this place." Thomas got all the building skills in the family. "I was just lucky enough to get a good teacher," Thomas said. He glanced at Victoria. "Good teachers make all the difference." "Dr. Morrison says the same thing," Victoria said. "He is talking about retiring in a few years, and he wants me to take over his practice. It is a terrifying thought, being responsible for all those patients on my own." "You will be wonderful at it," Thomas said with complete confidence. "You are already wonderful at it." Victoria felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Over the past weeks, she had come to realize that what she felt for Thomas was far more than professional concern for a patient. She thought about him constantly when she was not with him, wondered how he was healing, looked forward to her visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with medicine. But he was recovering, would soon be back to his normal life, and she had no idea if he felt anything similar. After dinner, Sarah excused herself to check on something in the kitchen, leaving Thomas and Victoria alone in the dining room. Thomas stood, moving more easily now, though he still favored his left side, and walked to the window. "Come look," he said. "You can see the harbor from here." Victoria joined him, standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The harbor was beautiful in the twilight. Ships' masts silhouetted against the darkening sky, lanterns beginning to glow along the waterfront. Seattle was growing fast, changing almost daily, and from this vantage point it looked full of possibility. "I never properly thanked you," Thomas said, not looking at her. "For what you did on that mountain. You saved my life, Victoria. You stayed up all night keeping pressure on that wound. You got me to safety. You took care of me when you could have just left me to die. I owe you everything." "You do not owe me anything," Victoria said softly. "I did what anyone with medical training would have done." "No," Thomas said, finally turning to face her. "You did more than that. You gave me hope when I thought I was finished. You made me want to survive, to heal, to have a future." He took a breath, gathering his courage. "And I find myself wanting that future to include you, if you would be willing." Victoria's heart was suddenly pounding. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have fallen in love with you," Thomas said. The words came out in a rush, unpolished but utterly sincere. "Somewhere between bleeding out in the snow and recovering in that cabin and these past weeks, I fell completely in love with you. You are smart and brave and beautiful, and I cannot imagine going back to a life where I do not see you every day. I know I do not have much to offer right now, just dreams of building a better boarding house and maybe eventually having my own carpentry business. But if you could see your way to giving me a chance, I would spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." Victoria stared at him, joy and disbelief warring in her chest. "You love me," desperately, Thomas said. He reached out, tentative, and took her hand. "I know it is fast and maybe it is crazy, but that is how I feel. You do not have to feel the same way, I just needed you to know." "Thomas," Victoria said, and her voice was shaking. "I love you too. I have been trying to talk myself out of it because it seemed impossible, but I cannot stop thinking about you. You are kind and honest, and you make me laugh even when everything is terrible. I want that future you are talking about. I want it with you." Thomas felt like his heart might burst. He pulled her closer, mindful of his still healing side, and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and when they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "So we are doing this?" Thomas asked. "Really doing this, Victoria confirmed. "Though we are going to have to figure out the practical details. My work keeps me busy, and yours will too once you start the expansion." "We will figure it out," Thomas said. He kissed her again, longer this time, and when Sarah came back from the kitchen and saw them, she smiled and quietly left them alone. The months that followed were busy and happy. Thomas threw himself into the boarding house expansion, his strength returning fully as the wound healed into a scar. He hired a small crew and oversaw the construction personally, his carpentry skills proving everything he had claimed. The addition was beautiful, well-built and functional, adding 6 new rooms that Sarah filled almost immediately with boarders drawn by the quality of the accommodations and the food. Victoria continued her work with Dr. Morrison, her reputation growing as word spread about her skill and dedication. She made her rounds to the camps and settlements, always careful now in bad weather, always carrying enough supplies to handle emergencies. And whenever she came back to Seattle, she went to Thomas, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing, building a foundation of shared understanding and affection. They were married in the spring of 1883 in a simple ceremony at the church on 3rd Avenue. Sarah cried happy tears, and Dr. Morrison gave Victoria away, beaming with paternal pride. It was a small wedding, just close friends and family, but it was perfect. Thomas wore a new suit that made him look distinguished, and Victoria wore a dress of pale blue silk that Sarah had helped her sew. "I cannot believe this is really happening," Victoria whispered to Thomas as they stood at the altar. "Believe it," Thomas whispered back. "You are stuck with me now." They moved into a small house near the boarding house, close enough that Thomas could oversee any maintenance needs but far enough to give them privacy. Thomas set up a workshop in the back, taking on carpentry jobs around Seattle, building furniture and doing repair work. His reputation grew quickly, and he found himself with more work than he could handle, exactly the kind of problem he was happy to have. Victoria continued working with Dr. Morrison, but as his health declined and he truly began to retire, she found herself taking on more and more of the practice. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, being responsible for so many lives. But Thomas supported her completely, never complaining when she was called away at odd hours or came home too tired to do anything but collapse into bed. They made it work because they both wanted it to work, because they had fallen in love in the most unlikely circumstances and were determined not to waste the second chance they had been given. Every morning, Thomas would kiss Victoria goodbye and remind her to be safe. Every evening, Victoria would come home and find Thomas working on some project or other, and he would stop whatever he was doing to hold her and ask about her day. 2 years into their marriage, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening when he came in from the workshop, flour on his hands from helping Sarah with baking. "I have news," she said, and something in her voice made him stop and give her his full attention. "Good news or bad news?" Thomas asked, though his heart was already hoping. "Good news," Victoria said, smiling. "The best news, we are going to have a baby." Thomas swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests, his face split by a grin so wide it hurt. "We are going to be parents," he said, wonder in his voice. "A baby, our baby." "Our baby," Victoria confirmed. She put her hand on her still flat stomach. "Due in December by my calculations." The pregnancy was smooth, despite Victoria's insistence on continuing to work until she was physically unable to do so. Dr. Morrison, fully retired now, scolded her fondly and told her she needed to take better care of herself. Thomas worried constantly, hovering until Victoria had to remind him that pregnancy was not an illness, and she was perfectly capable of managing her own health. Their son was born on a cold December night in 1885, almost 3 years to the day from when Victoria had found Thomas bleeding in the snow. The labor was long and difficult, and Thomas paced outside the bedroom door while Sarah and a midwife attended Victoria. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he nearly collapsed with relief. Sarah opened the door, smiling. "You have a son, Thomas, and Victoria is fine. Tired, but fine." Thomas went in and found Victoria propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Thomas, meet your son." Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. He was red-faced and wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus on the new world around him. Thomas felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "He is perfect," Thomas said, his voice rough. "You are perfect. I love you so much." "I love you too," Victoria said. She settled the baby into Thomas's arms, showing him how to support the head. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had not settled on anything. Now, holding his son, Thomas thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The robbery, the blizzard, the unlikely chance that had brought Victoria to that exact spot on the mountain at the exact right time. "How about Daniel?" Thomas suggested. "Daniel Morrison Yates, after the doctor who trained you." Victoria's eyes filled with fresh tears. "He would be so honored." "Daniel it is." Little Daniel was a healthy, hungry baby who kept them both awake at odd hours and filled the house with the sounds of infant life. Thomas built a beautiful cradle with intricate carvings, and Victoria sang lullabies she half remembered from her own childhood. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than they had ever been. Sarah doted on her nephew, coming by almost daily to help out and give the new parents a chance to rest. Dr. Morrison visited when his health allowed, holding the baby with shaking hands and declaring him a fine, strong boy. The community that Thomas and Victoria had built around themselves rallied to support them, bringing food and baby clothes and advice both wanted and unwanted. As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, Thomas's carpentry business continued to flourish. He had hired an apprentice, a young man eager to learn the trade, and together they were building a reputation for quality work. Thomas found deep satisfaction in creating things, in taking raw wood and shaping it into something beautiful and functional. It was the life he had dreamed of back when he was 16, and he never took it for granted. Victoria had officially taken over Dr. Morrison's practice, though the elderly doctor remained available for consultation until his death in 1887. The funeral was heavily attended, a testament to how many lives he had touched, and Victoria gave a eulogy that had half the mourners in tears. She had lost a mentor and a friend, but she carried on his legacy, providing the same compassionate care to Seattle's growing population. In 1888, Victoria gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Emma Grace. She was smaller than Daniel had been, with her mother's gray eyes and a temperament that seemed calmer from the start. Daniel, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything and asking endless questions about why she was so tiny, and when she would be big enough to play. The house filled with the cheerful chaos of family life. Thomas added on a room to give the children more space, and Victoria cut back on her house calls, focusing more on patients who could come to the small office she maintained in town. They were building a life together, brick by brick, moment by moment, founded on the love that had grown from a single night of keeping pressure on a wound in the frozen mountains. Years passed in the way that years do when life is full and good. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and showed an early aptitude for mathematics. Emma was sunny and social, making friends wherever she went and keeping her parents entertained with her creative stories. Thomas's business expanded further, and he took on a second apprentice, thinking about the legacy he wanted to leave. Victoria's practice thrived, and she trained 2 young women who wanted to follow in her footsteps as nurses. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1893, Thomas took Victoria back to the mountains. They left the children with Sarah, who was delighted to spoil them, and rode out on a clear spring day. Thomas led them to the old trapper's cabin, which was still standing though more weathered than before. "I wanted to see it again," Thomas said, helping Victoria down from her horse. "The place where you saved my life." They went inside, finding it much as they had left it a decade before. The stove was still there, the bunk, the rough table. Someone had used it since, left fresh firewood and supplies, continuing the unspoken code of the wilderness. "It seems smaller than I remember," Victoria said, looking around. "But I suppose everything does in memory." "I was so sure I was going to die that night," Thomas said. He put his arm around Victoria, pulling her close. "And then you appeared out of the snow like an angel, and you refused to let me give up. You kept me alive through sheer force of will." "We kept each other alive," Victoria corrected. "You held on when most people would have let go. You fought to survive." "Because you gave me a reason to fight," Thomas said. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Every good thing in my life started that night. You, our children, the work I love, all of it traces back to the moment you found me. I thank God for that blizzard every day." "I thank God for it too," Victoria said. She kissed him, soft and sweet, tasting of the life they had built together. "Though I would prefer not to repeat the experience. Once was quite enough terror for a lifetime." They stayed at the cabin for a few hours, talking about everything that had happened over the past decade, making love in the afternoon light, and simply being together without the demands of children and work pulling them in different directions. It was a gift this time, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. Riding back to Seattle as the sun set, Victoria leaned back against Thomas and sighed with contentment. "We should do this more often. Take time just for us." "Agreed," Thomas said. "Maybe next time without the life-threatening injuries." Victoria laughed. "Definitely without the life-threatening injuries." The years continued to unfold in patterns of work and family, challenge and joy. Daniel went to university, the first in either of their families to do so, studying engineering with the same focus he had brought to everything since childhood. Emma became a teacher, working with young children, and showing the same patience and compassion her mother brought to medicine. Both children grew into adults their parents were proud of, carrying forward the values of hard work, kindness, and resilience. Thomas and Victoria grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with years of laughter and tears. Thomas's hands became gnarled with arthritis, but he kept working as long as he could, teaching his apprentices and designing rather than building when the physical work became too much. Victoria's eyes weakened, requiring spectacles, but her mind remained sharp, and her dedication to her patients never wavered. In 1905, Daniel married a lovely young woman he had met at university, and they gave Thomas and Victoria their first grandchild, a boy named Thomas Daniel Yates, who everyone called Tommy. Emma married 2 years later, a fellow teacher, and they had twin girls who were the light of their grandfather's life. Sarah, who had never married, remained close to them all, running the boarding house until she was too old to manage the stairs, then moving in with Thomas and Victoria so they could care for her. She died peacefully in 1908, surrounded by the family she had helped create, and they buried her next to their parents in the Seattle cemetery. "She gave up so much for me," Thomas said at the funeral, his voice breaking. "When our parents died, she could have made her own life, but she stayed and took care of me." "And you took care of her," Victoria reminded him, holding his hand. "You gave her a family, a purpose, a life full of love. She died happy, Thomas. That is all anyone can ask for." As they entered their 60s, Thomas and Victoria slowed down considerably. Thomas retired from carpentry entirely, spending his days in the garden Victoria had cultivated or playing with his grandchildren. Victoria gave up the medical practice to one of the women she had trained, though she still offered consultations when asked. They had earned their rest, earned the right to sit on their porch in the evening and watch the sun set over the harbor. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked one evening. They were sitting in matching rocking chairs he had built years ago, watching Tommy and the twins play in the yard. "Giving up so much of your career for family?" "Never," Victoria said firmly. "I loved my work, but I love our life together more. And I still got to help people, still got to practice medicine for most of my life. I have no regrets, Thomas. Not one." "Neither do I," Thomas said. He reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "Best decision I ever made was falling in love with you." "You did not decide to fall in love with me," Victoria pointed out, amused. "It just happened." "Then best thing that ever happened to me," Thomas amended. "Better than I deserved, definitely." "Stop that," Victoria said. "You deserved every bit of happiness, and so did I. We found each other when we needed each other most, and we built something beautiful. That is all that matters." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their grandchildren play, the sounds of their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. This was what they had survived for, Thomas thought. This moment and thousands like it, strung together into a life well lived. In 1912, Victoria fell ill with pneumonia. It came on suddenly during a particularly harsh winter, and despite the best medical care available, her lungs simply could not fight the infection. Thomas sat by her bedside for 3 weeks, holding her hand and telling her stories about their life together, about the children and grandchildren, about the cabin in the mountains where it all began. "I am not afraid," Victoria told him one evening when her breathing was particularly labored. She was 73 years old and had lived a full life, but Thomas was not ready to let her go. "I have had the most wonderful life, Thomas. You gave me that." "We gave it to each other," Thomas said. He was crying openly now, not caring who saw. "I cannot imagine life without you, Victoria. I do not know how to do this." "You will do it the same way you did everything else," Victoria said. "With strength and grace and love. You will take care of our family, you will watch our grandchildren grow, and you will remember that I loved you every single day we had together." "I love you," Thomas said, leaning close. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Victoria whispered. "Forever, Thomas, forever." She died that night, peacefully in her sleep with Thomas holding her hand. The funeral was large, attended by dozens of people whose lives she had touched through her medical work and her kindness. Daniel gave the eulogy, his voice strong despite his grief, talking about his mother's courage and compassion and the example she had set for all of them. Thomas grieved deeply, feeling as though half of himself had been torn away. But he did as Victoria had told him, living each day for their family, spending time with his grandchildren and telling them stories about their grandmother. He lived 3 more years, kept going by love and stubborn determination, the same qualities that had helped him survive that frozen mountain so long ago. He died in his sleep in 1915, at the age of 76, in the house he had shared with Victoria. His children found him in the morning, peaceful in bed, a small smile on his face. On the nightstand beside him was an old, faded bandage, the one Victoria had used that first night in the cabin, which he had kept all these years as a reminder of the night his life truly began. They buried him next to Victoria in the cemetery overlooking the harbor, the city they had both loved spread out below. The headstone was simple, carved by one of Thomas's former apprentices with the skill Thomas had taught him. It read, "Thomas and Victoria Yates, together forever," and below that, a single line that their children had chosen. "Love found in the snow." Daniel inherited his father's carpentry tools and passed them down to his own son. Emma kept her mother's medical journals, preserving them for future generations. The boarding house that Thomas had expanded stood for another 40 years before being torn down for new development. But the house Thomas built for his family remained, solid and well constructed, a testament to his skill and care. Their great-grandchildren heard the story of how Thomas and Victoria met, about the blizzard and the gunshot wound, and the long night keeping pressure on the wound until the bleeding stopped. It became family legend, the kind of story that was told at gatherings and passed down through generations, about love found in the most unlikely circumstances, and a life built on the foundation of that single night of survival. And in the mountains east of Seattle, the old trapper's cabin still stood for many years, maintained by travelers who used it and left it better than they found it, continuing the unspoken code of the wilderness. Some people said it was haunted by the ghosts of lovers who had sheltered there, but those who stayed the night felt only warmth and peace, as if the cabin itself remembered the love that had begun within its walls and was blessed by it. The story of Thomas and Victoria Yates became part of Seattle's history, one of countless tales of courage and survival in the early days of the city. But for those who knew them, who had been loved by them, and had witnessed their devotion to each other over decades, it was more than a story. It was a testament to the power of compassion, to the miracle of finding love in the darkest moments, and to the truth that some connections are so strong that they transcend circumstance and endure beyond death. They had met in blood and snow, in pain and terror, when Thomas was bleeding out in the frozen mountains and Victoria found him and kept pressure on the wound all through the night. From that single act of mercy and courage, from that determination to save a stranger's life, had grown a love story for the ages, a partnership that had lasted decades and created a legacy of family and community that would continue long after they were gone. It was, in the end, exactly the kind of life they had both imagined during those long hours in the cabin, when the storm raged outside and the future was uncertain. They had built something lasting, something beautiful, something worth all the struggle and sacrifice. And if they could have seen it all from that first night, seen the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, seen the businesses and the careers and the lives touched, they would have known that every moment of pain had been worth it for the joy that followed. Thomas and Victoria Yates had found each other in the wilderness, and in finding each other, they had found home. Their love story, born in the frozen mountains of the Pacific Northwest in December of 1882, lived on in the memories of their descendants and in the history of the city they had helped build. It was a story of survival, of compassion, of two people who had been given a second chance and had seized it with both hands, creating a life that neither could have imagined alone. And somewhere, perhaps in that space beyond this world, they were together still, Thomas and Victoria, watching over the family they had created and the legacy they had built, their hands intertwined as they had been that first night and every night after, bound together by a love that had conquered death itself and would endure forever.